Everyone, my name is Arjun Panchakati. Welcome to my Public Health 2 case study. I looked at Patty Young and smoke-free airplanes. So let's look at some of the things through a public health perspective, looking at some of the background through the case study as well. Some of the background is that airline smoking previously to around the 1990s and more formally in the 2000s when the policy was passed to ban all smoking on aircraft. Smoking was permitted in zones, there's specifically non-smoking and smoking zones. So yeah, Patty Young, who witnessed this smoking, she was born and raised in a household with smoking. Her mother was a big smoker, and she saw smoking as basically legalized addiction, right? And she didn't want to see this promoted at all. And she was able to find her career as a flight attendant because she loved not being restricted by the 9 to 5 while also having the freedom to travel to all these places and not having to report to a boss. But while working, her background of being surrounded by smoking, she noticed that a lot of the passengers and the people at the time who went on planes, the flight attendants were exposed to a lot of secondhand smoke, which became a huge issue as she continued throughout her career and she saw a lot of her colleagues and a lot of previous flight attendants come down with severe lung infections or diseases due to the secondhand smoke. Also, she noticed that a lot of these aircraft had to make emergency landings or were made or were at severe risk for damage because of improperly extinguished cigarettes. So she also noticed this as a huge like flight risk as well. So learning for analyzing and prioritizing what we're going to look at. So Patty Young faced a lot of resistance in her fight to kind of advocate for these flight attendants, and this was a huge problem because there was these big corporations, tobacco companies, and even political groups like Republican groups that were opposed against government regulation that had immense pushback. And it's very hard to fight against this institutionalized setback because she's only this one person. And a lot of these unions weren't at the time weren't as powerful in order to lobby and to actually create change. On the other hand, socially, cigarette smoking was considered a norm. So it was really, really hard to combat this norm and kind of introduce change, which is always hard. So looking at a little like SWOT analysis of this, a strength is that it had scientific backings and other flight attendants had experience with this. The adverse effects of secondhand smoke. Weakness was because they were facing these strong tobacco companies and these Republican parties. This lawful policy change was hard to implement. But they had an opportunity through congressional hearings and lawsuits that Patty Young would later kind of pioneer and use to create that systemic change. But this was later on, and this opportunity really was hard to get. Earlier in her fight and the fight towards non-smoking airplanes, she had to resort to word of mouth and a lot of connections and trying to build some sort of substantive argument through that. The threat was that a lot of the lawyers would not undertake this class action lawsuit, especially against tobacco companies and these huge corporations that they would most likely lose to, or I guess they would have to be risking their career. So some of the root cause and some alternative solutions I was looking at. So I believe the root cause was just that the health of the flight attendants and all the non-smoking passengers on board, and even the smoking passengers actually, were exposed to the secondhand smoke. And even though this wasn't studied extensively, secondhand smoke and just smoking in general was known to have adverse effects. So this is the root cause that kind of sparked this argument, this policy, that the secondhand smoke, as well as the safety of smoking on aircraft, put the people in there in jeopardy. So some alternatives could include mandating and installing smoke filters to help, clear out the smoke and possibly mitigate it that way by using real-time like kind of clearance. But that would be very expensive and kind of possibly contribute to adding weight to the aircraft. Another alternative could be having more public education efforts to increase awareness about the adverse effects of smoking, as well as the incidents and crashes that do lead to um, airplane crashes. And we can do this using the health belief model. So the threat is risk of increased cancer possibly, and other obviously adverse effects, and also crashing of the airplane. And we could look at the number of crashes caused by smoking to kind of put it into perspective. And a way to convince people would be maybe, oh, if their loved ones were airplane attendants, or imagine that their family members were people on the plane that had this problem with smoking, where there was an unlit or a lit cigarette that was not properly extinguished, and they could be at jeopardy. So kind of appealing to both the logical and emotional sides of people. So some of my recommendations that I saw for this argument specifically in smoking in airplanes, and some that Patty Young also used, would be to lobby Congress by gathering support groups and unionizing to actually build that voice. Because at the end of the day, you do need a lot of support, either financially or socially, to be able to actually enact change at that systemic level. And then taking legal action against corporations so they're held accountable for their actions and what they are doing. Because these tobacco companies, they a lot of times they worked strictly for profit, and they did not pay any regard to the actual safety and the well-being of the people on the airplane, because they wanted to push their product and push and continue the booming tobacco industry at the time. So an action plan to try and implement this policy would be to create a smoking ban policy, which would take around 2 months. And some of the people responsible would be the health officials and health executives of these airline companies. So we just outlined the ban, and then we used a public awareness to try and bring more people on board. And this would take around 2 months as well, and involve like influencers, people in media, people just in general, could be anyone, right? Publicizing this issue and bringing attention to this issue. So we look at distributing pamphlets, possibly leaving notices at doors or giving people calls, and just any way to try and get the word out there. And then we can look at training staff and monitoring once we kind of establish that support and that policy. And then we come to training the staff to try and actually implement this. So this would include the training officials at the airline companies, as well as the public health officials that overlook it. So training on these compliance policies, as well as de-escalating with customers or passengers that have a problem with this policy. Also looking at compliance over a couple months to a couple weeks, or having this weekly check-in or monthly check-in, so we can see how this training is going and how both the flight attendants as well as the passengers are reacting to it. And then we look at evaluating and modifying, because it's always important to reflect and to see where we can improve. So this would be the responsibility of the flight attendant unions, the passenger groups, and the health analyst groups, to see if there are any improvements that can be made, and if any changes can be made to improve the policy and make it better for everyone. And to conclude, we've had this policy, and it only fairly recently got to the point where it is internationally recognized to um, be non-smoking in aircrafts all over the world. But countries like Australia, New Zealand, and Canada followed similar implementation to the United States, where there's litigation passed to ban smoking in airplanes, which is backed by a lot of scientific evidence regarding cigarettes and their linking to combustion that could create huge problems in aircraft, especially because of the highly pressurized nature of the cabins, as well as the oxygen content of the cabins. It posed a huge risk. So I think the best implementation of the policy is using this method of legislation, and backed by, public views and public educations, so that people come together and bring this to a legislative level, where it can actually cause systemic change and actually create policy that can negate some of the severe health consequences associated with something like secondhand smoke or ignition due to a cigarette, especially in a case like airplanes. Thank you for listening. Have a good day. Thank you.